The first day I walked into that office, I could almost see the lines painted on the floor, metaphorical of course, but so clear. My cubicle was in the far corner, a small gray space, with a computer that took 10 minutes to boot up, and my manager, his name was Bill. He laid it out for me in the simplest terms possible. He said my job was to process the inbound supply chain invoices, just the invoices, not to question them, not to analyze the patterns, just to check the math and push them through. Accounting, he called it my lane. He said, master your lane. And in a few years, who knows, he smiled this patronizing little smile. I nodded, I played the part. Then they did. I knew their clients, their roots, their weaknesses, their potential, all while sitting in my gray cubicle processing invoices. Bill would sometimes make a comment about my old car. Richard would walk by and make a joke about me always having my nose in a spreadsheet. They thought I was just being diligent. They had no idea I was building a war chest right under their noses. I watched Apex for 2 years. I saw their mismanagement take its toll. They lost a big client. Their debt covenants were tightening. The next 2 years were a blur of caffeine and code. We weren't just refining the algorithm anymore, we were building an entire stack around it. A new protocol for data transmission. A new architecture for server farms that was radically decentralized. We designed it to be not just better, but fundamentally different. Their system was a centralized hub-and-spoke model, like a grand train station, where every piece of data had to pass through a few choke points. Ours was a mesh, a web, where data could find the fastest path dynamically, without asking for directions. It was faster, yes, but its real strength was its resilience. It had no single point of failure. Then came the crucial decision: do we open this up, make it a public standard, and try to win the market through collaboration? Or do we keep it closed, build a walled garden, and force everyone to come to us? We debated it for weeks. An open approach had moral appeal. It was how the internet itself was born. But it also meant we'd be competing with the giants from day one, and they had the resources to outmarket us. To create a competing open standard that was just good enough to create confusion, a closed system, a proprietary platform, was riskier. It was all or nothing. But if we controlled the core technology, if we owned the patents on the fundamental methods of communication, then we wouldn't just be a company, we'd be a utility, we'd be the highway. And so we chose to buy the highway. We spent every dollar we had, and then millions more from a venture capitalist who saw the same vision on acquiring a small, almost forgotten research firm. They held a portfolio of patents related to foundational network routing on their own. They were worthless combined with our protocol. They were the deed to the land our highway would be built on. We now owned the intellectual property that anyone would need to build a truly modern network. We just hadn't turned the key yet. The launch was quiet at first. We didn't have a big marketing campaign. We targeted the players the old guard had ignored: small, nimble internet service providers in emerging markets, data-hungry research institutions, and a few cutting-edge financial trading firms for whom a millisecond advantage was worth billions. We gave them access to our platform. We became their invisible infrastructure. The effect was like a virus. These small providers started offering speeds and reliability that the legacy giants couldn't match at half the price. The research institutions began sharing datasets that were previously thought too large to move. The trading firms made fortunes. That was the tipping point. The stories started appearing in the tech press, not about us directly, but about this mysterious quantum leap in performance for our partners. The legacy companies first responded with denial. They called it a niche solution. They said it wasn't enterprise grade. But their biggest clients started asking questions. Why was a small ISP in Southeast Asia able to offer a better connection than they could? The pressure built. Their stock prices began to dip. They were no longer the inevitable titans. They were the slow-aging dinosaurs. I'll never forget the day the first of them came to us. It was the same company whose boardroom I had been dismissed from years earlier. They sent a delegation, led by a different executive this time, a younger woman with a sharp, anxious look in her eyes. They sat in our office, which was now a bright open-plan space, with standing desks and whiteboards covered in equations. The power reversal was palpable. They weren't offering me advice anymore. They were asking for help. They needed to license our technology. The moment came in a quarterly industry report. Apex was listed as vulnerable to acquisition. It was time. Needed to integrate our protocol. Their entire business was facing obsolescence, and the only life raft was the one I had built. The phrase "stay in your lane" hung in the air unspoken, but understood by everyone in the room I hadn't stayed in my lane. I had built a faster, smoother, more direct route, and now they were stranded on the off-ramp begging for a map. Today our protocol is the global standard. It's not even called by our company name anymore, it's just how data moves. We are the invisible plumbing of the digital world. And with that power comes a profound responsibility. We have to be careful, ethical. We can't throttle competitors or play favorites with access. Because we're no longer just a company, we're a foundational layer of modern society. The lesson I learned, the one I want to share with you, is that the most powerful form of disruption isn't about inventing a better mousetrap. It's about inventing a new kind of cheese that makes the old traps irrelevant. It's about refusing to see the world as a series of lanes laid down by others. The digital age is still young. The maps are still being drawn. So I want you to ask yourself, what does the current landscape ignore? What inefficiency is everyone just accepting as the cost of doing business? And what would it look like if you stopped trying to build a better car and started drafting the blueprints for your own highway? The first video I ever posted was a fluke. I was just trying to figure out how to change the headlight on my car. I set up my phone on a tripod, recorded the whole messy process, the swearing. When I dropped the bolt, the genuine triumph. When the light finally flicked on, I uploaded it, without thinking much, just a 10-minute clip, unedited, raw. A week later, it had 500,000 views. The comments were full of people saying the same thing. Finally, someone who doesn't make it look easy, you actually showed the struggle. Thank you. The algorithm, this mysterious invisible force, picked it up and shot it out into the world. I didn't understand why, but I understood the result. People were subscribing. So I made another video fixing a leaky faucet, then another patching a hole in drywall. Within a few months, I had 250,000 subscribers. My lane, as they call it, was carved out for me. I was the everyday fix-it guy. The algorithm loved consistency. It rewarded me for staying in that neat little box. Post a video about basic plumbing, 1,000,000 views. Post a video about anything else, crickets. I did a test, once a vlog about a hike I went on. The views were a fraction of my normal numbers. The comments were brutal. Stick to what you know, man, where's the wrench? I subscribed for the repairs. Was a golden cage. The analytics were my warden. Every day I'd check the numbers, the watch time, the click-through rate, the audience retention graphs. I was feeding the machine, and the machine was feeding me. But I started to feel this claustrophobia. I was playing a character, the fix-it guy. But I had other ideas. I wanted to talk about the business behind home repair, the psychology of why we neglect small problems until they become big ones. I wanted to interview architects, engineers, city planners. I even hinted at it in a video. The audience pushback was immediate. The algorithm's response was even more definitive. A dip in performance, a warning, stay in your lane. The process was clinical. I used a shell company I'd set up for this exact purpose. The negotiations were tense, but they were desperate. They never knew who was on the other end of the phone. They just knew the offer was serious, and it was their best way out. The day the papers were signed, I felt a calm I hadn't felt in years. I owned Apex Couriers. I owned the... And that's when I realized the lane wasn't just a suggestion, it was a control mechanism. The platform didn't want versatile, unpredictable creators. It wanted reliable, predictable content modules that it could slot into its advertising machine. My value was in my predictability. The platform's limits became my limits. I was dependent. I was living on rented land, and the landlord could change the rules anytime. So I decided to stop being a tenant and start being a developer. I stopped trying to fight the algorithm from within my little box. Instead, I decided to learn how to build my own boxes. This started with a deep, almost obsessive analytical dive. I wasn't just looking at what videos performed well. I was trying to understand why. I spent thousands on online courses about the platform's infrastructure, about data scraping, about trend analysis. I learned about the recommendation engine, how it weights user engagement, how it creates feedback loops. I realized the content was just the surface. The real highway was the infrastructure beneath it. The email lists, the direct connections with an audience, the owned media. So while I kept posting my regular fix-it videos to keep the algorithm happy, I started building in the shadows. The first step was a simple plaintext newsletter. I promoted it subtly at the end of my videos. If you want a deeper dive into the tools, I use sign up for my weekly email. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine. I owned those email addresses. The platform couldn't take them away. Then I started a podcast, not about home repair, but about building and making a broader theme that gave me the freedom I craved. I interviewed a master carpenter about the philosophy of his craft. I had a software developer on to talk about building digital products. I promoted it exclusively to my newsletter subscribers. It was my own little ecosystem, completely separate from the platform's algorithm. It was small at first, but it was independent. The strategic expansion was quite methodical. I used the revenue from the platform to fund these side projects. I wasn't just a content creator anymore, I was quietly building a small media company. The acquisition of influence came next. It wasn't a literal highway, but it felt like a smaller niche website dedicated to tool reviews was going out of business. I used my savings to buy the domain and its entire archive of content. It was an asset, a piece of digital real estate that I now controlled. I redirected its traffic to my newsletter and my podcast. I was no longer just driving on the platform's road. I was starting to build my own exits and on-ramps. Diversifying the content empire was key. I launched a second YouTube channel, but this one was hosted on a different, more creator-friendly platform. As a backup, I started selling a few physical products, a line of toolkits I had designed it through my own website, not through the platform's merch system. Every new asset was a brick in my own wall. The goal was to create a network so interconnected that if one platform decided to change its algorithm or demonetize me, the entire structure wouldn't collapse. It would be an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. The next Monday, I walked into work like it was any other day. I waited for the weekly operations meeting, the one where Richard would preside and Bill would sit quietly in the corner. They were all there complaining about Apex. Actually, a shipment was delayed. Useless company, Richard grumbled. That was my cue. I stood up. I didn't raise my hand this time. I just spoke. The delay with the Caliber Tech components has been resolved. The shipment will be here by noon. Richard scowled. And how would you know that I took it? The power shift happened so gradually, I almost didn't notice it. I reached a scale where my own Mediath newsletter, the podcast, the website was generating significant revenue on its own. My audience wasn't just a number on a platform's dashboard anymore. It was a community I could communicate with directly. I could launch a new product and know exactly who to tell. I could test an idea and get immediate, unfiltered feedback. I was no longer at the mercy of the algorithm because I had my own distribution channel. Then came the announcement. I remember recording the video. It was the scariest thing I'd ever done. I titled it, "Why I Am Not Just the Fix-It Guy Anymore." I didn't post it on my usual schedule. I sent an email to my newsletter list, first telling them it was coming, then I uploaded it in the video. I was honest. I talked about feeling trapped. I explained the journey not as a rebellion, but as an evolution. I showed them the highway. I introduced my podcast, my website, the team I had built behind the scenes. I showed them the blueprint of the ecosystem I had created. The reaction was surprising. Instead of anger, there was overwhelming support. The audience felt like they were being let in on a secret, like they were part of the journey. The video didn't just perform well, it became my most viewed video ever. The algorithm, ironically, loved the meta-story of a creator breaking free. The platform itself took notice. I started getting emails from partnership managers, not just from the support team. They wanted to explore synergies. The relationship had changed. I was no longer just a user, I was a partner in some ways. I had become a minor competitor. I had assets they didn't control. The data advantage was the final piece, because I now had my own website, my own newsletter, my own store. I had a holistic view of my audience that the platform itself didn't have. I knew what they bought, what emails they opened, what podcast topics they listened to all the way through. I could see the entire journey. So, when I created a new video for the platform, it wasn't a shot in the dark. It was informed by deep insight. I knew exactly what my audience wanted often before they did. That knowledge made the content I produced for the platform unstoppable. It was perfectly tailored, because I had a richer, more intimate set of data than the platform's own analytics could ever provide. The core lesson, the one that changed everything for me, was this: you can't win a game by just playing by the rules. You have to understand why the rules exist, and then you have to learn how to build your own playing field. The goal isn't to have a viral video. The goal is to have a sustainable future. The advice I give to every creator now is simple: build assets you own. Your email list is more valuable than your subscriber count. Your website is more valuable than your profile page. The platform is a tool for discovery, a megaphone, but it should never be your home. You need to build your own home. Deep breath, this was the moment, because I received the tracking confirmation directly from the CEO, which is me as of 5 p.m. last Friday. I am the sole owner of Apex Couriers. The ultimate goal is sovereignty. It's about waking up and knowing that your creative and financial future is not tied to a single line of code written by a stranger in a Silicon Valley office. It's about having a direct relationship with the people who enjoy your work, without a middleman dictating the terms. The highway isn't a metaphor for more fame. It's a metaphor for ownership. It's the infrastructure you control. It's the ability to change direction, to build new roads, to go wherever you want because you're not just driving on someone else's pavement. Anymore, you poured the concrete yourself, and that makes all the difference. For the longest time I lived in a very small room inside my own head. The walls were thin, and the voice was loud. It was my voice. But it didn't feel like mine. It felt like a critic, a permanent resident, who had taken up space without my permission. Its favorite words were, "You're not good enough for that." It would list the reasons: you don't have the right degree, you didn't come from the right family, you stumbled last time, remember, you failed. At that person rejected your idea, they were right to do so. And the room just kept getting smaller. Every external criticism, every rejection email, every awkward silence, after I shared an ambition, became another brick in the wall. I started to believe that my designated space, my lane, was this cramped, safe, predictable path. It was uncomfortable, but it was familiar. The fear of stepping outside of it was greater than the misery of staying. But the desire for more, for a bigger life, was like a constant dull ache, a tension that throbbed right behind my eyes. Voice was so much louder than the ache. It was the warden of my own personal prison, and I had handed it the keys. The turning point wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a lightning bolt. It was more like a slow dawning exhaustion. I was just so tired of listening to that voice, tired of the constant hum of anxiety, tired of watching other people live the lives I wanted, thinking they must have some secret I lacked. I realized the only thing they had that I didn't was a different soundtrack playing in their heads. So I made a decision. It was the quietest, most significant decision of my life. I decided to evict the critic. I decided to do a full-scale top-to-bottom renovation of my own mind. It started with observation. I began to just notice the voice instead of arguing with it, or blindly believing it. I'd just acknowledge it. Oh, there it is again. You're going to embarrass yourself. Okay, noted. And then I'd deliberately choose a different thought. It felt fake at first, ridiculous. But I kept doing it. I sought out tools. Therapy taught me to trace the voice back to its origins, to see that it was often just a scared child's interpretation of an old event. Meditation taught me to create a space between a thought and my reaction to it. I realized I didn't have to be my thoughts. I could just have them, and then let them go if they weren't serving me. I became a voracious reader, but not for entertainment. I was searching for a new blueprint. I read about cognitive behavioral techniques, about neuroplasticity, about the stories of people who had overcome far greater obstacles. I found a mentor, someone who saw the potential I couldn't see in myself. They didn't offer magic solutions. They just asked better questions. What evidence do you have that y'all fail? And when I'd list the old failures, they'd say, that's the past. What's the evidence from this week? The silence was absolute. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Bill's mouth was hanging open. Richard's face went through a journey: confusion, disbelief, and then a slow dawning horror, as he realized the power dynamic had just been inverted. He was no longer the customer, he was a client. My client. He started to sputter. You. What? How? This is highly irregular. I stayed perfectly calm. It's quite simple. You told me to stay in my lane. And I did. I mastered it. I just decided that the lane ended. Started an evidence log. It was just a notebook. Every day I'd write down one small win. A difficult email. I sent a task I completed well, a positive piece of feedback. It felt stupid writing down such tiny things. But over weeks and months, that notebook became the most powerful weapon against the voice. When the critic would whisper, "You're incompetent," I could open the book and say, "Actually, here are 57 examples that prove otherwise." I completely reframed my idea of failure. Instead of seeing a missed goal as a verdict on my worth, I started seeing it as data. It wasn't I failed, it was that approach didn't work. What did I learn? What variable can I change? Next time setbacks lost their terrifying power. They became simply information, part of the process. It was like I was a scientist experimenting with my own life. And there was no such thing as a failed experiment, only results that pointed me in a new direction. Then one day it happened. I was faced with an opportunity that a year before would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety. A big project. A real stretch. The old voice piped up a faint echo from the empty room it used to occupy. You're not ready. But this time a new voice answered, a quieter, calmer, much stronger voice. It said, no one is ever fully ready. But I am capable, I am resourceful, I have a history of figuring things out. It was a moment of synthesis. The tools weren't just tools anymore, they were part of my foundation. The new mindset had become the default. I took the leap, I pursued the goal. But it felt entirely different. There was no desperation, no frantic energy of trying to prove myself. There was just a steady, capable focus, of course. There were challenges, obstacles came up that would have paralyzed the old me. But now I didn't see insurmountable walls, I saw puzzles to be solved. It approached them with a sense of curiosity. What's the root cause? Who can I ask for help? What are three possible solutions? The panic was gone, replaced by a quiet resilience. The external achievements started to follow almost as a natural byproduct: the promotion, the successful launch, the recognition. But the strange thing was those things didn't feel like validations anymore. They were just confirmations of what I already knew to be true inside. That's when I understood the highway. All those years, people telling me to stay in my lane, they were just describing the cramped little road they saw from the outside. They couldn't see the vast interconnected network of potential that was already inside me, waiting to be developed. Buying the highway wasn't about acquiring something external. It was about making the ultimate investment in myself. It was about purchasing with my effort and my courage the deed to my own mind. I owned the entire infrastructure now: the on-ramps, the off-ramps, the overpasses, the scenic routes. The freedom is unbelievable to operate from a place of confidence, not fear, to know that no matter what happens, I have the internal resources to handle it. The most valuable thing you will ever acquire is not a car or a house or a job title. It is the ownership of your own psychology. It is the quiet certainty that you are the architect of your inner world. When you own the road system of your own psyche, when you've done the work to pave every mile and light every path, no one can ever tell you to stay in your lane again, because you don't just have a lane, you own the whole damn map. At the on-ramp to a much larger road, a road that it turns out you need access to, so from now on all communications regarding Apex's services will go through me. Be setting new service standards. The old inefficient pricing model is terminated. Have a new contract sent over to you by the end of the day. The first time I heard it was almost friendly, a piece of advice from a well-meaning mentor. You have to understand how this industry works, he said, leaning back in his expensive leather chair. You're a bright kid, ambitious. But you need to stay in your lane, focus on the opportunities that are actually meant for you. Don't rock the boat. He said it with a smile, like he was letting me in on a secret to success. And for a long time, I thought he was right. That was the game you played, by their rules. You smiled at the right people, you were grateful for whatever scrap they threw your way. You stayed in the narrow, poorly maintained lane they had designated for people who looked like you. But the lane was a trap. It was designed to keep you moving, but never really getting anywhere. It was the systemic barrier, not written down in any official policy, but etched into every conversation, every funding decision, every hiring committee. It was the lack of access to venture capital for founders from our community, the assumption that our stories weren't commercial enough for the big media outlets, the way the doors to real decision-making rooms were always mysteriously just a little too heavy for us to push open. We were allowed to be in the building sometimes, but never on the floor where the real blueprints were drawn. And the most insidious part was the pressure to assimilate, to be the acceptable face of diversity. I saw it happen to so many talented people. They'd get that one coveted spot, that token position on a board or in a C-suite, and the message was clear: you made it, now be quiet, don't make the others uncomfortable by talking about the millions still stuck in the lane behind you. Your success was supposed to be proof that the system worked, that anyone could make it if they just tried hard enough, but we all knew it was a lie. Their success was an exception that proved the rule, a carefully managed illusion of inclusion. The frustration of that tokenism was a constant low hum in the background of our lives. We were tired of begging for a seat at a table that was never built for us, at a feast where we were never meant to be more than waitstaff. It wasn't just about individual success anymore, it was a collective ambition. We'd meet up after work in basements and coffee shops, and the conversation was always the same. We were architects, engineers, artists, entrepreneurs, all brimming with ideas. But we were constantly hitting this invisible ceiling. We had the talent, we had the drive, What we didn't have was the infrastructure. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as intended to keep us out. And that's when the idea shifted. It stopped being about how we could fit into their world. It became about how we could build our own. The turning point was a conversation with an older friend, someone who had been fighting this fight for decades. He looked at me tired, but clear-eyed, and said, "They will always own the lane. The power isn't in asking for a wider lane. The power is in owning the road." And that was it. That was the moment the entire framework shifted. We weren't going to stay in our lane. We were going to buy the whole damn highway. So we started building. It began with a series of late-night conversations that turned into a concrete plan. We called it the Sovereign Network. It wasn't just one thing, it was an entire ecosystem. We knew we couldn't go to the traditional banks or venture firms. Their money came with strings attached, strings that would inevitably pull us back into their lane. So we looked to our own community. We launched a crowdfunding campaign. But it was more than that, it was a movement. We held town halls virtual. And the shift was instantaneous. The condescension was gone, replaced by a nervous, sickeningly sweet deference. They needed me now. Bill couldn't even make eye contact. Richard started talking about partnership and synergy, using words he'd never used with me. Before I held up a hand, "The terms are non-negotiable. This isn't a partnership. This is a new supplier relationship. My company will provide a superior service, but it will be on my terms. The innovation you always stifled, that's now the baseline." If you in person, we explained the vision, a venture fund by us, and for us a media platform to tell our stories, unfiltered, a tech incubator to nurture our innovators, a professional network that wasn't about who you knew, but what you could build together. The response was overwhelming. It wasn't just the money, though, that poured in from hundreds, then thousands of people, small donations, large investments, everything in between. It was the energy. People were tired of waiting for permission. They were ready to build. We pooled our resources, not just capital, but expertise. We had lawyers working pro bono, marketers donating their time, experienced executives offering to mentor the first cohort of startups. We were building sovereign infrastructure, creating the pathways that had never existed for us before. I remember the day we officially launched the Sovereign Ventures Fund. It was in a rented office space, nothing fancy. But the room was packed. There were journalists there, from the mainstream outlets, finally curious about what we were up to. But more importantly, there were hundreds of people from our community, entrepreneurs with prototypes in their backpacks, filmmakers with scripts they'd been told were too niche, young students looking for a sign that there was a place for them in this world. The symbolic act of buying the highway was becoming real. We weren't just talking about change. We were laying the asphalt, pouring the concrete, erecting the signs. The growth was slow at first, then it began to accelerate. Our first major success story was a young woman named Anya. She had a revolutionary idea for a sustainable packaging material, but she'd been rejected by every single traditional VC firm. Too risky, they said, not a proven market. She came to us, her confidence shaken. But our fund was built on a different kind of calculus. We saw the potential not just in her product, but in her vision. We funded her. We connected her with mentors within our network. We helped her navigate the manufacturing process. Within 2 years, her company was not only profitable, it was being hailed as an industry disruptor. And the best part, she turned down a massive acquisition offer from one of the very firms that had rejected her. She said, "I built this with my community. I am keeping it in my community." That story echoed. It empowered others. One by one, the successes started to stack up. A filmmaker from our network won a major international award for a documentary that no traditional studio would touch. A software company we incubated created hundreds of jobs in a neighborhood that had been written off as an investment desert. We were creating tangible results. We were proving that our ideas were not just viable, they were exceptional. And the old system, they started to take notice. It was no longer about them giving us chance, it was about them wanting a piece of what we had built. They started calling us. They wanted partnerships. They wanted to invest in our fund. The shift was profound. We had moved from pleading for a place at their table to defining the terms of engagement for our own. The power dynamic had fundamentally changed. The long-term vision, though, is what truly matters. This isn't about a single successful fund or a handful of companies. It's about generational wealth and influence. It's about creating a foundation so solid that our children and grandchildren won't ever have to hear the phrase, "stay in your lane." They will inherit the highway. They will be the architects of their own destiny. The lesson we learned, the one I want to pass on, is that real lasting change doesn't come from asking for a wider lane within a system designed. Want to use my highway? Y'all follow my rules. The first rule is efficiency. The second is respect. I looked directly at Bill. There will be no more discussion about lanes to constrain you. It comes from building a better, faster, more equitable highway for everyone behind you. It comes from looking at the map they've given you, seeing the limitations they've imposed, and deciding to draw a new one entirely. So this is a call to action. Look around your own community. Identify the systemic gaps. Where are the lanes that are keeping people confined? Is it access to housing, to education, to artistic expression? You don't have to start with a venture fund. Maybe you start with a community land, trust a scholarship fund, a local cooperative rally, the people who share your frustration and your ambition. Pool your resources, your skills, your passion. Build something that is truly yours. The ultimate power is not integration into a structure that was never meant to hold you. The ultimate power is sovereignty. It's the power to build your own institutions, to tell your own stories, to control your own economic future. They told us to stay in our lane, so we bought the highway. And let me tell you, the view from up here is incredible. Walking out of that meeting room was like stepping into a new world. I went back to my cubicle, only to clean it out. The feeling wasn't of vengeance, it was of quiet finality. I had built something they could never give me. And in doing so, I had made their approval completely irrelevant. I ran Apex with the vision they had mocked. We streamlined the routes, implemented real-time tracking. And within 6 months, we were the most reliable courier in the state. The company I'd left behind, they became one of my. For a while, I did exactly that. I became the fastest invoice processor in the department. But I couldn't just turn my brain off. I started noticing things: the same supplier month after month, with a 10% price increase, that no one seemed to question the shipping costs from a particular warehouse, that were triple what the logistics should have been. I'd compile little reports. Nothing fancy, just the data, and a few observations. I'd bring them to Bill. His reaction was always the same: a sigh. He'd best customers because they had no other choice. The lesson was carved into me: true power isn't about climbing a ladder that someone else built. It's about realizing the ladder is leaning against the wrong wall. The lane they assign you is an illusion, a comfortable fiction, designed to make you manageable. The real map of success is blank. And you are the cartographer. Opportunity isn't something you wait for, it's something you identify, you analyze, and you acquire. It's a financial power. Play a silent strategic game played over years. You don't ask for a seat at the table. You don't even build a better table, you buy the company that makes the tables, and then you charge rent. Your ambition is the most valuable asset you have, but you have to stop spending it on their dreams and start investing it in your own. Let them have their narrow, painted lanes. Your job is to acquire the whole highway. And when you do, the sound of their deference is the only applause y'all ever need. Success, real success, is the only rebuttal that echoes forever. They told me I had a gift. That's how it always starts, right? They see something you're good at, something that resonates with a certain group of people, and they give it a name, a label. For me, it was cozy fantasy. I was the person who wrote those gentle stories about quiet villages, kind-hearted dragons, and adventures that always ended with a cup of tea by the fireplace. And I was successful at it. My books sold, my readers were loyal. They'd write to me saying my stories were a comfort, a safe place to escape to. And for a long time, I loved being that for people. But that's the thing about building a safe place. After a while, the walls start to feel less like protection and more like a cage. I started to see the patterns in my own work. The same themes, the same tone, the same emotional resolution. It became a formula. A very successful, very lucrative formula. My publisher would send me covers to approve, and they'd all have the same aesthetic: soft watercolor art, friendly lettering. The marketing copy was always some variation of from the best-selling author of Cozy Comfort. They had built a box for me, and I was sitting inside it, smiling for the camera. It started small. A character would pop into my head, who was angrier, more complex than anyone who belonged in one of my worlds. I'd imagine a scene with real moral ambiguity, where the right choice wasn't clear, where the tea got cold, and the fireplace went out. I'd jot these ideas down in a separate notebook, a secret one, feeling a strange sense of guilt, like I was cheating on my own career. My agent would call, thrilled with the latest sales figures, and say they know what they want from you, just give them more of the same. And I'd nod along, but that secret notebook felt heavier and heavier. The pushback came when I finally tentatively mentioned I was thinking of maybe possibly introducing a slightly darker subplot. In the next book, the silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. Then came the gentle, reasonable cautions. Your audience loves you for what you do. This is your brand. Don't confuse your readers. You've found your lane. Stay in it. They said it with such conviction, as if they were stating a fundamental law of physics. I was a cozy fantasy author. That was my lane. To step outside of it, take the paper, glance at it, and say this is good initiative. But it's not really your concern. This is above your pay grade. You need to stay in your lane. He use that phrase like a mantra, stay in your lane. It was a warning, a way to keep the structure intact. Was professional suicide, but the alternative, staying in that comfortable, gentle lane, forever, felt like a different kind of death, a slow, quiet fading away of everything that made me want to write in the first place. The decision wasn't a loud, dramatic moment. It happened at 3 in the morning, staring at a blank document on my screen. I had been trying to outline another cozy story, and the words felt like ash in my mouth. They were hollow. I was going through the motions. I closed that document. I opened a new one. And I just started writing, not the story I was supposed to write, but the one that had been burning in the back of my mind for years. A story about a war not acquainted venture, a story about loss and bitterness and the difficult, messy work of forgiveness that doesn't always end neatly. I didn't tell my agent, I didn't tell my publisher. This was just for me, a rebellion in a word processing file. The process was terrifying and exhilarating. I felt like I was learning to write all over again. I had to study new things. I read military history, not for grand battles, but for the psychology of soldiers. I immersed myself in hard sci-fi, trying to understand how to build a world with rigid logical rules. Then I'd twist those rules in ways that felt almost magical. I was taking the tools I'd honed in my cozy story, character, depth, emotional honesty, and applying them to this brutal, complex canvas. It was a fusion, the heart of my old work meeting the spine of something entirely new. The vulnerability was constant. Every day, a voice in my head would whisper, "Who do you think you are? You can't do this." They were right. Some days, I'd delete thousands of words. But I always went back, because for the first time in years, the writing felt alive. Finishing the manuscript was one thing, deciding what to do with it was another. The fear returned tenfold. This wasn't a secret notebook anymore. This was a completed novel. I remember the day I sent it to my agent. My hand was shaking so much I could barely click the send button. I prepared for the worst, for the phone call telling me it'd ruined my career, that the book was unsellable, that I needed to get back in my lane immediately. The call came. There was a long pause after I said hello. Then she said, "I have no idea what this is." I stayed up all night reading it. I cried twice. It's not what anyone expects from you. It's brilliant. She wasn't sure how to sell it, but she believed in it. We decided to go for it. No half measures. We would present it not as a departure, but as an evolution. The launch was surreal. The cover was stark metallic, nothing like my previous books. The description promised a gritty philosophical war story. My established readers were confused. The comments started rolling and I was expecting something cozy. "This is so dark. This doesn't sound like her at all." I felt a cold knot of anxiety in my stomach. I had betrayed their trust. But then another wave of reactions came from readers I'd never seen before. Sci-fi fans, literary fiction fans. "This is incredible. The way it blends genres is masterful. The emotional depth here is staggering." The book started to find its own audience. It got reviews in publications that had never glanced at my work before. They called it a groundbreaking work of speculative fiction and a fearless fusion of heart and hardware. The purists of my old genre were disappointed, but a new, larger community was forming around this strange hybrid creation. It wasn't just a success, it was a different kind of success. It was proof that there was an appetite for work that refused to be categorized. The real turning point was the quarterly meeting. I was there to take notes. The department heads were discussing a major bottleneck with one of our key component suppliers. They were talking in circles for an hour, proposing superficial fixes, band-aid solutions. And I knew the answer. I'd traced the entire problem back to a single inefficient clause in the supplier's contract. A clause I'd identified 6 months prior. I raised my hand timidly. I explained it. The room went quiet. The head of procurement. The vindication was quiet, but profound. My publisher, who had been so cautious, was now eager to talk about my bold new direction. Other authors, who I knew felt similarly boxed in, reached out to me in private asking how I found the courage. The very people who had advised me to stay in my lane were now trying to understand the blueprint for the highway Id built. They wanted to know how to replicate it. But that was the point: you can't replicate it, you can only build your own. Looking back, the journey taught me everything about what it means to be an artist. The lane they try to put you in is just a map of where you've been. It's not a prophecy of where you can go. My identity as a creator isn't tied to a genre anymore. It's tied to my curiosity. My lane is wherever my imagination wants to travel next. It might be a quiet country road one day, and a sprawling 8-lane interstate the next. The freedom is in the movement itself, in the refusal to be parked permanently. If there's any advice I can give, it's this: don't let your past successes become a life sentence. Don't let your audience's love for one version of you prevent you from discovering all the other versions waiting to be born. The fear is real, the risk is real, but the feeling of creating something that is truly wholly yours, something that couldn't have existed if you had followed the rules, that feeling is worth any amount of uncertainty. They told me to stay in my lane, so I bought the whole highway, and let me tell you, the view from here is limitless. They always gave very simple, very clear instructions. It was a map, really a map for a small, orderly life. My father would point to it. This is the route: you finish school, not too much school, but enough to be respectable. You find a solid job, the kind with a pension, with a predictable schedule. You marry someone from a good family nearby. You buy a house in a neighborhood where the lawns are all trimmed the same height. You have your children, you raise them to follow the same map. That was the lane. It was painted with good intentions, with a desire for safety, for a life free from the terrifying uncertainties of ambition. And for a long, long time, I stayed in that lane. I believed it was the only road available to me. People like us, they'd say, we aren't the kind who start tech companies or write novels or travel the world. We're the foundation, we're the reliable ones, the gears that keep the ordinary world turning. And I convinced myself there was a quiet dignity in that. I pushed down the other things, the whispers that came late at night, the urge to pick up a camera and capture the way the light fell through the dirty window of my cubicle. The notebooks I filled with ideas for stories that felt too big, too strange for the person I was supposed to be. I internalized the limits so completely that they started to feel like my own ideas. This is all you can achieve: be content, be quiet. The moment of awakening wasn't dramatic. It was a Tuesday. I was standing at the photocopier at work, watching the green light sweep back and forth, humming that same monotonous hum it had hummed for a decade, and my eyes landed on a calendar on the wall. It was one of those inspirational calendars with a generic mountain scene, and a quote. That day's quote was: the only thing worse than being blind is having sight but no vision. And I looked from that quote to the stack of papers in my hand, the drab gray of the cubicle farm, to the face of my coworker in the next aisle, who had been in that exact same spot for 25 years, and had a plaque to prove it. And I felt a physical sensation, a tightening in my chest, a literal suffocation. This lane wasn't a path, it was a trench. And if I didn't climb out now, the walls would eventually close in over my head. Man named Richard looked at me like I'd just spoken in a foreign language. He didn't address the idea, he just looked at Bill and said, "Is this one of yours?" Bill turned bright red. He stammered, "She's enthusiastic." Ill talk to her. After the meeting, Bill didn't even look at me. He just said, "What did I tell you about staying in your lane?" That was the moment the frustration solidified into something else, something colder. I realized the lane wasn't about order or efficiency. It was a cage, it was a system. The quiet resolve happened that same night. I didn't burn any bridges. I didn't make a scene. I sat at my kitchen table, the surface scarred from years of family meals, and I opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, I didn't write a business plan or a manifesto. I just wrote a single sentence: what if the lane is a lie? And then I started to draw my own map. It was messy, full of dead ends and question marks. But it was mine. The dream was to build something, a company based not on ruthless profit, but on a simple, beautiful product, handcrafted furniture. It was a field I knew nothing about, a world away from spreadsheets and reports, but it felt real in a way nothing else ever had. The initial setbacks were brutal. I had saved a little money, but it vanished faster than I could have imagined. Wood, tools, space to work at all cost, a fortune. My first attempts were comical: a chair that collapsed under the slightest weight, a table that wobbled so badly you couldn't set a cup on it. The learning curve wasn't just steep, it was a vertical cliff face. And the lack of support was a constant chilling wind. My family thought I'd had a nervous breakdown. My father's disappointment was a heavy silence on the phone. My old friends would ask with that tone of pity how my little woodworking hobby was going. They saw the financial strain, the bags under my eyes, and they saw failure. They didn't see the education happening in the midst of the chaos. Hidden work was everything. While they thought I was throwing my life away, I was in a rented garage, my hands covered in splinters and glue, studying. I wasn't just sanding wood, I was studying grain structures, joinery techniques from centuries. Past the philosophy of design, I failed constantly. I ruined expensive pieces of oak and walnut. I made cuts that were a millimeter off, and had to scrap an entire project. I spent nights not sleeping, but reading about business, law, marketing, supply chains. This was all conducted in solitude, away from the judgmental eyes of the world. Left behind it was a secret apprenticeship with myself, as both the master and the bumbling student. But slowly, I built a new support system. It started at a lumberyard, talking to an old man who could tell the history of a tree just by looking at a board. He became my first mentor. He showed me tricks that weren't in any book. Then I found online communities, forums filled with other craftspeople who spoke a language I was finally beginning to understand. They believed in the vision of creating things that lasted, things with a soul. They didn't care about my past or my pedigree, they cared about the dovetail joint. Just perfected. This new community was my scaffolding. They held me up when I was ready to collapse. The small victories were like sparks in a dark room. The first time I sold a piece, a simple cherrywood box, to someone I didn't know. The first positive review online. The day a local boutique agreed to carry a few of my smaller items. These milestones were tiny in the grand scheme, but they were monumental to me. They were proof the map I was drawing wasn't leading into the wilderness. It was leading somewhere tangible. Each small success fueled a fiercer determination. It was no longer about proving them wrong, it was about proving myself right. Designed to keep people like me, people who actually saw the cracks in the foundation, safely tucked away, where we couldn't disrupt the comfortable incompetence of everyone else. I saw Richard, a man who'd gotten his job because he'd been there for 20 years, not because he had a single original idea. And I knew I would never ever get a promotion based on merit. The system was built to prevent that. The achievement, when it finally came, was quieter than I'd ever imagined. It wasn't a roaring crowd or a trophy. It was an email. A representative from a major luxury hotel chain had seen my work somehow and wanted to commission furniture for their entire new line of boutique hotels. It was a contract so large it dwarfed the total salary of my entire previous career. The success wasn't just financial, it was a validation of the entire philosophy, the belief that beauty and integrity mattered. It was success that was utterly impossible on the old prescribed path. The confrontation with the past was inevitable. I didn't seek it out, but it happened at a family wedding. There I was surrounded by the same people, the same conversations. But I was different. They asked the usual questions, expecting the usual tales of struggle. When I told them simply, and without boastfulness, about the contract, the change in the room was palpable. The surprise on my father's face wasn't just about the money, it was a reevaluation. He was looking at me, truly looking. For the first time years, he saw confidence instead of doubt, purpose instead of drift. There was envy from some, a quiet, grudging respect from others. But the dynamics had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer a subject of their concern or pity. I was an equal, perhaps even something more. The internal victory, though, was what mattered. Lying in bed that night, the profound satisfaction was a physical warmth. I had done it not for them, but for me. I had proven my own potential to myself. The person I was told to be, the narrow lane I was meant to occupy, was a fiction. The real me, the one who could imagine a beautiful thing and then build it with his own hands. That was the truth. That knowledge was worth more than any contract. View from the highway is entirely different. It's not about looking down on the old lanes. It's about seeing the whole landscape spread out before you, full of infinite possibilities. Achieving the impossible changes your entire outlook. Problems become challenges, obstacles become puzzles. The fear that once ruled my life has been replaced by a steady curiosity. The message is so simple, it's almost embarrassing. The only lane that matters is the one you choose to build for yourself. You are the architect, the surveyor, and the construction crew. No one else can draw your map. It is never ever too late to pick up the pencil and start drawing. You might be in the deepest trench, surrounded by the loudest voices telling you to stay put. But the walls are only as high as you believe them to be. The first step is the smallest one. It's buying the notebook. It's making the first terrible wobbling chair. It's believing the whisper in your heart over the roar of the crowd. They told me to stay in my lane, so I bought the highway, but the ultimate purchase wasn't the success or the business, or the freedom from financial worry. The ultimate purchase was freedom itself, the freedom to define my own life on my own terms. And that is a possession that can never be taken away. You start with a single thread, that's all it is. You have a product, a service, something you can do better than anyone else. For us, it was a software patch, a tiny piece of code, that solved one specific frustrating problem in a massive, clunky industry. We were the best at that one thing, and everyone told us to be happy with that, to stay in our lane. So I stopped trying to get a promotion. The goal was to get a better seat at their table. The goal was to own the table, the entire restaurant. The shift was seismic. It happened quietly inside my own head. I stopped seeing myself as an employee and started seeing myself as an investor, a future owner. The lane they were so obsessed with, it was just a small, poorly maintained access road. What I wanted was the highway. And I knew exactly which highway. There was a small specialized logistics company we used. Our lane was comfortable for a while. We had clients, we made a profit. But from day one, we felt the friction. Every time we tried to deliver our perfect little service, we'd hit a wall. We relied on another company for server hosting, and their infrastructure was slow, outdated. We depended on a separate logistics partner to handle the physical components, and they were constantly delayed, losing packages, providing terrible customer service. Our payment processor took a huge cut, and their system was full of glitches. We were a sleek, high-performance engine bolted onto a broken-down wagon. Our customers didn't see the wagon, they saw the entire jerky, unreliable ride. And we took the blame for failures that weren't even ours. That was the first crucial lesson. You experience every single crack in the road. When you were the one getting jostled around, we weren't just selling a service. We were living the industry's inefficiencies. We felt every single pain point personally. And that's when the vision shifts. It stops being about having the best product in the lane. It starts being about owning the highway itself. I remember looking at a flowchart of our own operation, and it was a mess, arrows pointing everywhere to a dozen different external companies, each one a potential point of failure. And I thought, what if all these arrows pointed inward? What if we controlled every single touch point, from the raw materials to the moment the product is in the customer's hands? The ambition wasn't just to grow bigger, it was to become the environment in which our competitors had to operate. The skepticism was immediate, and it was loud. Investors said we were suffering from a lack of focus. They called it a vanity project. Peers in the industry smirked. They said, you're a software company, stick to code. You don't know anything about supply chain management, about hardware, about logistics. Y'all dilute your brand, y'all go bankrupt. The phrase "stay in your lane" wasn't advice. It was a warning from people who were terrified of the ambition itself. We ignored them, but we weren't reckless. This wasn't about a wild spending spree. This was a calculated, strategic campaign. The first step was to map the entire highway. We diagrammed our industry from end to end. Where does the raw material come from? Where is it processed? How is it assembled? How does it get shipped? How does the customer pay for it? How is it supported? We identified every single company, every technology, every choke point. We created a blueprint for total control. Then came the acquisitions. We started small, using the profits from our core service. The first one was the server company that had caused us so many headaches. They were a small outfit struggling, but they had the hardware and the parts we needed. Buying them was like fixing the foundation of our own house. Suddenly our service was faster, more reliable, and we had a new revenue stream. We could now host our competitors. That was the first taste of power. The next phase was more aggressive. We took on debt, lot of it, to acquire the logistics firm. That was a scary leap, but it was the key to the entire customer experience. Now, when a customer ordered from us, we controlled the delivery. We could guarantee speed. We could track it perfectly. The packaging was pristine. The customer wasn't just buying a product, they were buying a flawless experience. The boldest move was acquiring our former competitor. This was a company that had laughed at us years earlier. They were bigger, older, but slower. They had a strong brand, but a weak, outsourcing dependent model. We saw they were vulnerable. We launched a takeover that was deemed hostile by the market. But we knew their weakness was our strength. We weren't just buying their customers, we were buying their market share and eliminating a rival all at once. And with each acquisition, a beautiful thing happened: synergy. The logistics firm used the software from our original company to optimize its routes. The server company now had a guaranteed major client in us, stabilizing its revenue each piece. made the other pieces stronger, more efficient, more profitable. We weren't a collection of companies. We were building a single integrated machine. Occasionally called Apex couriers, they were brilliant, but poorly managed. They handled all the delicate high-priority shipments that our main courier couldn't. I'd seen their invoices too. They were struggling, their pricing was erratic. They were a gem buried under bad leadership. And debt, they were the highway, they were the key to the entire regional distribution network. If you controlled Apex, you controlled the flow of critical components for a dozen companies, including mine. Then, almost without noticing, we arrived at a new reality. We had achieved a vertical monopoly. We controlled the raw materials, the manufacturing, the software platform, the distribution, the sales channel, and the customer support. We weren't just a player in the industry. We were the industry. The competitive advantage was absolute. A new startup couldn't compete with us, because to compete they'd have to build not just a better product, but an entire better ecosystem. They'd have to somehow replicate our seamless end-to-end control, which would require billions of dollars and years of effort. We had built a moat around our castle that wasn't just filled with water, it was filled with sharks. And the most valuable asset wasn't any single company we owned. It was the data. When you control the entire flow, you control the information. We knew everything. We knew what customers searched for before they bought. We knew how they used the product. We knew which shipping routes were most efficient down to the second. We knew which components failed. And why this data became the new highway. It allowed us to predict market trends, to innovate with pinpoint accuracy, to optimize every single process. Real-time, we were no longer reacting to the market, we were directing it. The moment of recognition came at a major industry conference. I was giving a keynote speech. The same people who had told me to stay in my lane were sitting in the audience. I wasn't introduced as a founder or a CEO, I was introduced as a visionary. The tone was different. It was respect. But it was also a little bit of fear. They weren't just looking at a successful businessman. They were looking at someone who had rewritten the rules of the game. The questions weren't about our product anymore, they were about our philosophy. They wanted to know how we saw the future, because we were clearly building it. So what are the lessons? The first is that strategic thinking will always beat pure execution. You can be the best in the world at executing a single task, but if you don't control the board on which the game is played, you're always at the mercy of someone else's mistakes. The second lesson is that buying the highway is a permanent solution. Staying in your lane means you're always subject to tolls, to traffic, to road closures imposed by others. Owning the highway means you set the tolls, you manage the traffic, decide who gets to drive fast and who gets slowed down. You have leverage that is virtually unassailable. If you want to apply this, look at your own field, draw the map. Where are the pain points? Who are the unreliable partners? Where are the inefficiencies? Is there a supplier that everyone hates? A distribution channel that is slow and expensive? That isn't a problem to be endured, it's an opportunity to be seized. The goal isn't to outcompete your rival in the next lane. The goal is to buy the pavement under their tires. The mindset shift is everything. Stop thinking like a player trying to win the game. Start thinking like the architect designing the stadium, because true lasting power doesn't come from winning a single race. It comes from owning the track. Don't just play the game on the board, every single square. The grind started then. It wasn't glamorous. I lived on a fraction of my salary. Ramen noodles and thrift store clothes became my normal. Every bonus, every tax return went straight into a brokerage account. I became a student of the market. Evenings and weekends were for reading financial statements, analyzing industry reports, studying mergers and acquisitions. I learned about debt structuring, about leveraged buyouts. I created a full financial model for Apex couriers. I knew their business better. The first time I presented to them, I was so naive. I walked into a boardroom that smelled like old coffee and older money. The table was this long polished slab of mahogany, and around it sat men in suits that cost more than my entire research grant. I had the future in my laptop, a data compression algorithm that was leaner, faster, and about 60% more efficient than the bloated Pachito. Their systems, the entire telecom industry, was running on. I showed them the graphs, the side-by-side comparisons. The numbers were undeniable. One of them, a guy with silver hair and a watch that probably needed its own insurance policy, leaned back and gave me this tired smile. He said, "Son, this is impressive, really, it's clever." And then he dropped the hammer. "But it's not how we do things here. Our infrastructure is built on a certain foundation, a reliable one. You can't just swap out the engine of a battleship While it's at sea, another one chimed in talking about integration challenges and backward compatibility. They weren't arguing with my math. They were telling me my math didn't matter. The last thing the senior VP said to me, as I packed up my things, was this piece of advice delivered with a sort of paternal condescension. He said, "You're a bright kid, a real innovator. But in this business, you need to learn to stay in your lane." Stay in your lane. I replayed that phrase in my head. All the way home, it wasn't just advice. It was a threat. It was the entire philosophy of their existence. Their lanes were these narrow, well-defined paths that led directly to their bank accounts. They owned the lanes, they maintained the lanes, and they charged exorbitant tolls to anyone who wanted to use them. My innovation wasn't a better car for their lane. It was a proposal for a whole new type of road, one that made their expensive, congested highway look like a dirt path, and that was the one thing they could not allow. For a few weeks I was despondent. I thought maybe I should just license the algorithm to some small startup, take a royalty and move on. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smug paternal smile, "Stay in your lane," and I realized something fundamental. They were right. But for the wrong reason. The problem wasn't my technology. The problem was the entire concept of a lane. They saw the industry as a fixed track. I started to see it as a wide open field. Why was I trying to build a better vehicle for their crumbling road when I could lay down my own asphalt, my own rules, my own entire network? That was the pivot, the moment of clarity. I stopped thinking about my algorithm as a product to sell. I started thinking of it as a cornerstone. If their entire empire was built on the inefficiency of data transfer, then my goal was to sell them a better tool. My goal was to make efficiency the new baseline, the new law. I gathered my small team, the engineers who had believed in the idea from the start. I told them, we were no longer in the business of asking for permission. We were going to build the place where permission was no longer required.